The snow falls without sound through the street lamps of Petrograd, each flake drifting past the stone facades of the Mocha River embankment, like ash from an invisible fire. And inside the basement chamber of Palace Number 94, beneath vaulted ceilings that smell of damp plaster and wine, a man who should not exist according to every law of medicine and mortality sits at a table, eating cakes that have been prepared with enough cyanide to kill 5 horses. His bearded face serene in the candlelight, his pale blue eyes watching the young prince, who has invited him here with an expression that might be amusement, or might be prescience, or might simply be the look of a Siberian peasant who has survived 30 years of winter and knows that all warmth is temporary. The date is December 30th, 1916, by the Gregorian calendar, December 17th, by the Russian one still in use, and the man eating poisoned cakes is Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin, faith healer to the Tsarina, confidant to the imperial family, and the most despised human being in the Russian Empire, a man whose very existence has become a wound in the body politic. And the young prince watching him, Felix Yusupov, 29 years old, Oxford educated, married to a niece of the Tsar, heir to the largest private fortune in Russia, has decided that this wound must be cauterized with bullets and river water, and the secret cooperation of men who believe they are saving their country, even as their country slides toward an abyss they cannot yet see. This account is drawn from declassified files and public archives, from surveillance reports compiled by the Okhrana, the Tsarist secret police, who followed Rasputin's every movement for years, from autopsy documents and forensic photographs that survived the revolution, from memoirs written by the conspirators themselves, memoirs that contain both truth and embellishment, history and self-justification, and from the testimony of those who found the body, 3 days later, frozen in the ice of the Little Nevka River, with a bullet wound in the center of the forehead that tells a different story than the one the killers chose to tell. Rasputin was born in 1869 in Pokrovskoye, a village so remote in western Siberia that news of the outside world arrived weeks late, if it arrived at all, a place where winter lasted 8 months, and the Tura River froze solid enough to drive horses across, where Orthodox Christianity mixed with older beliefs in spirits and healers, and where a boy who claimed to see visions might be beaten by his father, or might become a strannik, a wanderer, a pilgrim who walked from monastery to monastery, claiming to carry God's voice in his unwashed body. His father Yefim was a peasant farmer who drank and cursed and beat his sons, and his mother Anna died when Grigori was young, and the boy grew up wild and strange, known for stealing horses and for sitting alone in the fields, talking to invisible presences, known for his eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them, eyes that in photographs appear gray or blue, or sometimes almost silver, depending on the light, eyes that women later claimed could hypnotize, could command, could make them do things their orthodox souls told them were sinful, but which Rasputin insisted were holy, were necessary, were the very path to salvation through sin. In 1897, at age 28, he traveled to the Verkhocheri monastery and experienced what he described as a religious conversion, a moment when God spoke directly to him and told him he would heal the sick and guide the powerful, and whether this was genuine mystical experience or calculated performance, or some third thing that exists in the space between faith and manipulation, it set him on a path toward the Winter Palace and toward a basement room filled with candlelight and cyanide, and men who had decided his death was a political necessity. By 1903, he had reached St. Petersburg, arriving with no money, no connections, nothing but his reputation as a holy man who could heal through prayer and touch, and within 2 years, he had gained the attention of Grand Duchess Militsa and her sister Grand Duchess Anastasia, both married to Romanov cousins, both interested in mysticism and spiritualism, and the various unconventional religious movements that flourished in the late imperial period, when the Orthodox Church felt simultaneously eternal and ossified, and through them, he was introduced to the Tsar's family on November 1st, 1905, at Tsarskoye Selo, the imperial residence, 15 miles south of the capital, introduced as a holy man from Siberia, who had prophetic gifts and healing powers, and Nicholas II, 37 years old, soft-spoken, fond of English novels and long walks, a man who believed absolutely in his divine right to rule and his sacred duty to pass an intact autocracy to his son, received Rasputin with courtesy and then with something approaching hope, because his son, the Tsarevich Alexei, born 1904, carried in his blood the curse of Queen Victoria's lineage, hemophilia, a condition where blood will not clot, where the slightest bruise can become internal hemorrhage, where childhood itself becomes a minefield of potential death. The Tsarina Alexandra, born Princess Alex of Hesse, granddaughter of Victoria, carrier of the genetic mutation she had passed unknowingly to her only son, lived in constant terror that Alexei would fall, would bump a knee, would suffer one of the bleeding episodes that left him screaming in agony, while the best doctors in Europe stood helpless, able to do nothing but administer aspirin, which modern forensic analysis suggests actually worsened the bleeding, because aspirin thins the blood, a side effect unknown. In 1907, when Rasputin first helped the boy, what Rasputin did, according to sources that include the diaries of Anna Virabova, the Tsarina's closest friend, and the observations of court officials who witnessed these events, was enter the child's room when doctors had given up hope, when Alexei's leg had swollen to twice its normal size, and the boy writhed and screamed, and Rasputin would sit beside the bed and pray in a low voice and place his large peasant hands on the child and speak to him calmly. And within hours, sometimes within an hour, the swelling would decrease, the pain would subside, the boy would sleep. Historians and physicians have proposed multiple explanations that Rasputin's presence calmed the Tsarina, whose anxiety transmitted itself to her son, that Rasputin advised stopping medical interventions, including aspirin, which were doing more harm than good, that he possessed some genuine intuitive understanding of when a bleeding episode was beginning to resolve on its own, that he employed hypnotic techniques learned from folk healers in Siberia, that it was coincidence, combined with confirmation bias, combined with desperate parental hope, but to Alexandra, who watched her son recover after Rasputin's interventions when doctors had failed, when priests had prayed to no effect, when she had begged God for mercy and heard only her child's screams, Rasputin became irreplaceable, became holy, became the one person on earth who could save her son and therefore save the dynasty, because without Alexei, without a male heir, the 300-year-old Romanov autocracy had no future. From 1907 onward, Rasputin had direct access to the imperial family, could send telegrams that the Tsarina answered immediately, could request private meetings that were granted, could advise on matters of state and appointments to the Holy Synod, the governing body of the Russian Orthodox Church. And while his influence over Nicholas himself appears to have been limited, the Tsar being too stubborn and too convinced of his own divine mandate to take orders from a peasant, Rasputin's influence over Alexandra was profound, and Alexandra's influence over her husband was profound, and therefore by this transitive property of power, Rasputin became a figure who could make or break careers, who could recommend ministers, who accepted money to intercede in legal cases, who lived in a modest apartment on Gorokovaya Street, where petitioners waited for hours, hoping for his blessing, or his telegram, to someone in authority, or simply his touch, which was rumored to grant fertility to barren women, and where the Okhrana, the secret police, kept agents stationed day and night, compiling reports on every visitor, every telegram, every drunken evening, every woman who entered his rooms. The Okhrana files reveal a life lived simultaneously in two registers, the spiritual and the squalid. Rasputin, moving between the Winter Palace, where he kissed the Tsarina's hand, and prayed with the heir to the Russian throne, and the bathhouses and restaurants and private apartments of Petrograd, where he drank until dawn, and groped servant girls, and propositioned the wives of government officials with such crude directness that some filed complaints, which were quietly suppressed because the Tsarina would not hear criticism of her holy man, would not believe reports of his debauchery, insisted that his enemies were spreading lies, motivated by jealousy of his closeness to the imperial family. The surveillance reports from January through February 1916, excerpted from documents now held in the State Archive of the Russian Federation, detail visits to prostitutes, telegrams sent to the Tsarina, using intimate language that scandalized the agents transcribing them. Telegrams like, "I am full of sorrow, longing to get home. Although Anushka will have to undergo an operation, I cannot get away. How are you, kisses?" Sent to his wife in Pokrovskoye, while he spent nights at the Hotel Astoria with Princess Dolgorukiya, or messages to Vyrabova reading, "I rejoice in the revelation, am tortured by expectation. I kiss my darling," which might refer to religious matters, or might refer to something else entirely. The ambiguity itself being part of Rasputin's method, his ability to make every statement carry multiple meanings so that he could later claim he had been misunderstood. And the reports describe how on February 12th, he brought 6 drunken men to his apartment at 3:30 in the morning, one carrying a guitar, and they sang and danced until 6 o'clock, while neighbors complained. Or how on March 11th he returned home at 5 in the morning from the Savalev's residence and remained in bed all day in an exhausted condition. Or how on May 9th he sent the porter's wife to make an appointment with a masseuse who refused to see him, whereupon he went to the 18-year-old seamstress Katia, who lived in the same building, and told her, "Come to me in a week's time. I will give you 50 rubles. Or how on June 2nd, at 1 in the morning, he came home drunk with 2 male companions and sent the porter's wife for the masseuse Altina, who could not be found. So he went to the dressmaker Katia's apartment and was apparently refused entry because he came back directly, and on the stairs assaulted the porter's wife, asking for kisses, until his own maid, Donia, led him away." These reports were filed daily, meticulously, sometimes noting where Rasputin went, hour by hour, which suggests the Okhrana was not merely surveilling him, but building a comprehensive dossier on his activities, possibly for blackmail, possibly to document his influence, possibly because various factions within the government and aristocracy wanted leverage over him, or wanted evidence to convince the Tsar that Rasputin was a liability. And yet, despite thousands of pages of surveillance documenting his drinking, his sexual advances, his acceptance of bribes from merchants and contractors, seeking government favor, despite newspaper articles calling him a dissolute charlatan, despite warnings from ministers and from members of the imperial family itself, the Tsarina refused to remove him from her circle, refused even to limit his access, because every time Alexei had a bleeding crisis, it was Rasputin who could stop it, or who could convince Alexandra that it was stopping, which from her perspective amounted to the same thing. In July 1914, as Europe slid toward the First World War, Rasputin was stabbed in the stomach outside his home in Pokrovskoye by Kionuya Guseva, a 33-year-old peasant woman who had been influenced by the monk Iliador, a former associate of Rasputin, who had turned against him and who preached that Rasputin was not a holy man, but the Antichrist. And Guseva approached Rasputin as he left his house and plunged a knife into his abdomen, screaming, "I have killed the Antichrist." And Rasputin collapsed bleeding onto the dirt street and was carried to the village hospital and then to Tumen, where surgeons operated to repair the damage, his intestines having been perforated, and he spent weeks recovering in a hospital bed while Austria-Hungary issued its ultimatum to Serbia following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, while Russia mobilized its army in support of Serbia, while Germany declared war on Russia, the first domino in the cascade that would become the First World War. And Rasputin, lying in his hospital bed, sent multiple telegrams to Nicholas begging him not to go to war, warning that war would destroy Russia, would destroy the dynasty, would lead to catastrophe. But Nicholas ignored him, this being one of the few times the Tsar disregarded Rasputin's advice on a matter of supreme importance. And so on August 1, 1914, Russia entered the war that would kill 10 million people and end the Romanov Empire. By late 1916, after 2 years of war that had gone catastrophically for Russia, after defeats at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, after millions of casualties and mass retreats and critical shortages of weapons and ammunition, after Nicholas had taken personal command of the army in September 1915, leaving Alexandra effectively running the government from Petrograd, after a series of ministerial appointments and dismissals that followed Rasputin's recommendations, filtered through Alexandra, ministers who were chosen not for competence, but for their willingness to tolerate Rasputin's interference, or for personal loyalty to the Tsarina, the Russian political establishment had come to see Rasputin as a symbol of everything wrong with the autocracy, a peasant who manipulated the empress, who manipulated the Tsar while the country bled, and in the State Duma, the advisory parliament that Nicholas had been forced to create after the 1905 revolution, representatives spoke openly of dark forces controlling the throne, never quite naming Alexandra and Rasputin explicitly, but making the reference clear enough that everyone understood, and rumors spread that Rasputin was a German agent, that he was pushing for a separate peace with Germany, that he was sleeping with the Tsarina, which was almost certainly false, but which served as useful propaganda for those who wanted to delegitimize the regime. And soldiers returning from the front told stories of inadequate supplies and incompetent leadership, and asked why they were dying while a Siberian peasant lived in luxury and whispered in the empress's ear. Vladimir Purishkevich, a monarchist member of the Duma, gave a speech in November 1916, declaring that dark forces were destroying Russia from within, that the government was paralyzed by camarilla, by the shadow influence of unelected and unaccountable figures. And though he did not name Rasputin, the meaning was transparent, and after the speech, Prince Felix Yusupov approached Purishkevich and told him, "I quite agree with you, and it is time to act, not to talk." And together with Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a first cousin once removed of the Tsar, and 2 others including a military physician named Stanislaus Lazavert, they began planning Rasputin's murder, convinced that removing him would shock the Tsarina into reforming the government, would restore public confidence in the monarchy, would save Russia from revolution, this belief being as sincere as it was delusional, because removing Rasputin would not address any of the systemic problems facing the empire, the military failures, the economic crisis, the breakdown of food distribution, the growing radicalization of workers and soldiers. But the conspirators believed they were acting as patriots, believed history would vindicate them, and so they prepared a basement room in Yusupov's palace on the Mica River and purchased poison and planned the story they would tell afterward, the story of the man who would not die. The Yusupov Palace at number 94 on the Mica River embankment stands today as a museum. Its Baroque facade painted soft yellow, its interior rooms preserved with the furniture and art that survived the revolution. And in the basement, visitors can see the chamber where Rasputin was killed, a low-ceilinged space with stone walls and a vaulted brick ceiling, modest compared to the gilt reception rooms upstairs, but comfortable enough with a fireplace and wooden furniture and a bearskin rug. And it was here that Felix Yusupov planned to bring Rasputin on the night of December 17th, 1916, old calendar, telling him that Yusupov's wife, Princess Irina, wanted to meet the famous healer, Irina being the Tsar's niece, and therefore of interest to Rasputin as a potential connection, though in fact Irina was not in Petrograd at all, being in the Crimea, and the invitation was a fabrication designed to lure Rasputin to a place where he would be alone with his killers. The plan, as reconstructed from Yusupov's memoirs, published in 1928, and from testimony given by the other conspirators, in the days after the murder, and from contemporary police reports, was that Yusupov would bring Rasputin to the basement and offer him wine and cakes that had been laced with cyanide by Dr. Lazavert, potassium cyanide, crushed and mixed into the cream filling in the wine, enough poison, according to Lazavert, to kill 5 men, and once Rasputin died from the poison, they would dress him in warm outdoor clothes and drive his body to Petrovsky Island, where there was an ice hole in the Little Nevka River, and drop him through so that his death would appear to be an accident, a drunken man who had fallen through the ice, and the police investigation, if there was one, would conclude that the mystic's dissolute lifestyle had caught up with him, and the case would be quietly closed. On the evening of December 17th, Yusupov drove his dark green automobile to Rasputin's apartment on Gorokovaya Street, arriving near midnight, unusually late for a social visit. But Rasputin kept irregular hours and thought nothing of it, and he dressed in a blue silk peasant shirt embroidered at the neck and pulled on his heavy winter coat and his black leather boots and went down to the waiting car, telling his daughter Maria that he was going to visit the little one, his name for Yusupov, and Maria later recalled that her father seemed uneasy, seemed to hesitate at the door, but then he left, and the Okhrana agents, stationed outside the building, noted the time and the vehicle and the direction it headed, but did not follow because Rasputin often visited Yusupov, and they had no reason to suspect this visit was different from any other. The palace was dark when they arrived, except for lights in the basement windows, visible from the street level, Yusupov having arranged it so the approach would look natural, and he led Rasputin down a stone staircase to the basement chamber, where the gramophone was playing Yankee Doodle on a cylinder recording, an American tune that Yusupov thought would add to the casual atmosphere, and the room was warm from the fireplace, and the table held plates of small cakes glazed with chocolate and pink icing, and there was Madeira wine in a crystal decanter, and Yusupov invited Rasputin to sit and help himself while they waited for Irina to finish entertaining guests upstairs, though in reality there were no guests, and Irina was hundreds of miles away, and upstairs Purishkevich and Grand Duke Dmitri and Captain Sergei Sukhotin and Dr. Lazavert waited with a loaded Browning revolver, trying to stay quiet enough that Rasputin would not hear them pacing. Yusupov later wrote that he watched with growing horror as Rasputin ate 2 or 3 of the poisoned cakes and drank several glasses of the poisoned wine and showed no ill effects, that Rasputin talked about Siberia and the imperial family and the war, that his voice remained steady and his eyes remained bright, and after 30 minutes and then an hour, he was still alive and apparently healthy, and Yusupov excused himself and went upstairs where the other conspirators waited in disbelief and panic, because the poison should have worked within minutes, should have caused convulsions and death, and they discussed what to do, and Yusupov took the Browning revolver and went back downstairs, and at some point in the next few minutes, the sequence of events being disputed and contradictory between different accounts, he shot Rasputin in the chest, and Rasputin collapsed, and Dr. Lazavert came down and examined him and declared him dead, and the conspirators stood over the body, discussing how to transport it to the river, when, according to Yusupov's memoir, Rasputin suddenly opened his eyes and lunged at Yusupov with a roar, trying to strangle him, and Yusupov broke free and ran upstairs, screaming, "He's alive! He's alive!" And Rasputin followed him up the stairs and out into the courtyard, where Purishkevich fired 2 shots, one striking Rasputin in the back, and Rasputin fell in the snow, and Purishkevich fired again, hitting him in the head, and then, according to various accounts, Yusupov beat the body with a rubber club or a steel bar to make sure he was truly dead, and they wrapped the corpse in a blue curtain and tied it with rope and loaded it into the back of the automobile and drove through the empty snow-covered streets to Petrovsky Island, where they threw the body off a bridge into an ice hole in the Little Nevka River, and it sank beneath the black water and disappeared. This is the story Yusupov told, the story that became legend, the story of Rasputin the unkillable, immune to poison, surviving multiple gunshots, perhaps even still alive when he went into the freezing water, his death attributed variously to drowning or hypothermia, or finally, to the accumulated damage of everything inflicted upon him. A story that fit with Rasputin's mystical reputation, with the idea that he was somehow more or less than human, and Yusupov's memoir sold well and was translated into multiple languages and became the accepted narrative, but forensic examination of the available evidence, including the autopsy report and the post-mortem photograph discovered by police 2 months after the murder, tells a different story. Tells a story that is simpler and less supernatural and considerably more brutal. The post-mortem photograph shows Rasputin's face frozen and discolored, his beard matted with ice, and in the center of his forehead, just above the bridge of his nose, there is a circular wound with darkened edges and a visible muzzle imprint, the telltale signature of a contact gunshot, meaning the barrel of the gun was pressed directly against his skull when the trigger was pulled. And this wound by itself would have been immediately lethal, would have destroyed the frontal lobes and rendered him unconscious before death followed within seconds, or at most a minute or two, which means Rasputin was dead before he entered the water, which means he did not drown. And forensic pathologist Roger Byard, in his 2024 paper, analyzing the death notes, that the position and range of this head wound is inconsistent with Yusupov's story of Purishkevich shooting from a distance at a fleeing target, because a fleeing man does not take a contact range shot to the forehead, and the autopsy report, conducted by Professor Dmitry Kosaratov, documented that a gun had been pressed to his forehead, documented 2 additional gunshot wounds to the liver and kidney that would have been eventually lethal, but not immediately incapacitating, documented injuries to the face and body, including avulsion of the right eye and crushing of the genitals, though whether these were inflicted before death or resulted from the body being thrown off a bridge and retrieved with grappling hooks 3 days later cannot be determined with certainty, and crucially, the autopsy revealed no trace of poison in Rasputin's stomach or tissues, which contradicts the story of the cyanide-laced cakes and wine. And this absence of poison is corroborated by statements Lazavert made years later, suggesting he had balked at the last moment and had not actually poisoned the food and wine, a detail that would explain why Rasputin ate and drank without ill effect, and is further supported by the fact that Rasputin avoided sweet foods, believing they would diminish his spiritual powers. So even if the cakes had been poisoned, he might not have eaten them at all, the entire poisoning narrative potentially being a fabrication added by Yusupov to enhance the story, to make the killing seem more difficult and therefore more heroic, to transform a simple execution into an epic struggle. The simplest explanation, consistent with the forensic evidence, is that Rasputin was shot 3 times, twice in the torso and once in the head, that the head shot was administered at contact range, possibly as a coup de grace, after the torso wounds had incapacitated him, or possibly as an execution-style killing, while he sat or knelt in the basement room, and that he was dead before his body was wrapped and transported and dropped into the river, and the elaborate story of poison and superhuman survival was constructed afterward to mythologize the event, to justify the multiple weapons and the brutality by portraying Rasputin as somehow monstrous, as requiring extraordinary measures to kill, when in fact he died as any human would die, from bullets to vital organs and brain. The question that has intrigued historians and conspiracy theorists for over a century is whether British intelligence officers participated in the killing, whether the contact head shot was delivered not by one of the Russian conspirators, but by Oswald Rayner, a British Secret Intelligence Service agent who had been Yusupov's friend at Oxford University and who was in Petrograd in December 1916, working undercover, or by Captain Stephen Alley, another British agent operating in Russia at the time. And the circumstantial evidence for British involvement includes Rayner's known friendship with Yusupov, the fact that British intelligence was deeply concerned about Rasputin's influence and his opposition to the war with Germany. The fact that British agents in Petrograd were reporting to London that Rasputin was pushing for a separate peace that would allow Germany to move troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front, where British and French forces were barely holding the line, and the fact that the type of gunshot wound visible in the post-mortem photograph, a clean contact shot to the forehead, suggests someone with military or intelligence training rather than an aristocratic amateur. But the official files of MI6 contain no documentation of British involvement, and Keith Jeffrey, the official historian of British intelligence, found no evidence in the archives to support the theory, and without documentary proof, the British involvement remains speculative, plausible, but unproven. One more layer of uncertainty in an event that was covered in uncertainty from the beginning, because the killers told contradictory stories and destroyed evidence and benefited from the chaos of revolutionary Russia, which was not conducive to careful forensic investigation. What is certain is that on the morning of December 20th, 1916, old calendar, when Rasputin failed to return home, and his daughter Maria went to Yusupov's palace to inquire about her father, she found the courtyard stained with blood, found one of Rasputin's galoshes abandoned in the snow, found evidence of violence that the servants could not or would not explain, and she reported her father missing to the police, who began an investigation that quickly led to Yusupov and his co-conspirators. And by December 21st, the authorities had searched the Mocha River near the Yusupov palace and found nothing. And then on the morning of December 30th, exactly 100 years before this script was written, a patrolman noticed one of Rasputin's distinctive leather boots protruding from the ice near Petrovsky Bridge, and the body was recovered using axes and ropes and grappling hooks. The corpse frozen solid, wrapped in a blue cloth, weighted down with chains that had been intended to keep it submerged, but which had not been secured properly, and it was transported to Chesmy almshouse, where Professor Kosaratov performed the autopsy in the presence of police officials, who documented the wounds and took the post-mortem photograph that would later call the official story into question. The Tsarina ordered that Rasputin be buried immediately and quietly, and on January 2nd, 1917, old calendar, December 21st Gregorian, his zinc coffin was interred at a small chapel being built by Anna Vyrabova on the grounds of Tsarskoye Selo, the imperial estate, buried without public ceremony, attended only by the imperial family and Vyrabova and a few servants. Alexandra placing an icon signed by herself and her children inside the coffin before it was sealed, and Nicholas wrote in his diary that the weather was mild and gray, that they had buried our friend, that the Empress was very calm, which suggests either profound faith that Rasputin was with God or profound denial about what his death meant politically. And within weeks of the burial, it became clear that the conspirators' hope that killing Rasputin would stabilize the regime had been exactly backward, because removing him did nothing to address the military failures, or the food shortages, or the strikes that were beginning to paralyze Petrograd. And in fact, his murder further destabilized the monarchy by demonstrating that even people close to the imperial family, Grand Duke Dmitry, was a Romanov by blood, and Yusupov was married to a Romanov, felt free to commit murder with impunity, felt the Tsar's authority was weak enough that they could kill the Empress's closest advisor and face no serious consequences. And Nicholas's response was to exile Dmitry to the Persian front and to banish Yusupov to his estates, sentences so lenient they amounted to vindication. And other members of the aristocracy sent congratulatory letters to the killers, sent flowers and expressions of gratitude, and Purishkevich was celebrated as a hero by his colleagues in the Duma, all of which signaled to the public that the Tsar could not protect even his own household, could not maintain order even among the nobility. And this perception of weakness, combined with the ongoing disasters of the war and the breakdown of food distribution in the cities, created the conditions for the revolution that erupted exactly 11 weeks after Rasputin's death. February 1917. Gregorian calendar. Old-style March began with strikes in Petrograd on International Women's Day. Textile workers walking off their jobs to protest bread shortages, and within 2 days, the strikes had spread to other factories, and workers were marching in the streets, demanding bread and peace, and an end to autocracy, and garrison troops, ordered to suppress the demonstrations, refused to fire on the crowds, and in some cases joined them, and by March 2nd, the Duma had formed a provisional government, and Nicholas II, pressured by his own generals, who told him the army would not fight for him, abdicated the throne, ending 300 years of Romanov rule. And when the new government sent soldiers to Tsarskoye Selo to place the imperial family under house arrest, one of the first things the revolutionary troops did was to find Rasputin's grave and dig up his coffin. And on March 10th or 11th, accounts differ, they transported the coffin to an area near Lezno, on the outskirts of Petrograd, and burned it, destroyed it completely, because even dead and buried Rasputin represented everything they hated about the old regime, the superstition, the corruption, the deference to charlatans. And a report dated March 11th from a witness named Kupchinsky describes how the coffin was opened, how Rasputin's body was recognizable, how it was placed in a makeshift pyre and burned through the night until nothing remained but ashes and fragments of bone, and those remains were scattered, ensuring that Rasputin's resting place would be unmarked and unfindable, ensuring that there would be no shrine, no pilgrimage site, no cult of martyrdom, only absence and the stories people would tell. The stories multiplied over the decades, becoming myth, becoming legend. Rasputin, transformed in Western popular culture into a demonic figure, the mad monk, the sinister Svengali, who controlled the Tsarina through sex or hypnosis, or dark magic depending on which account you read. And in Soviet historiography, he became a symbol of aristocratic decadence and orthodox mysticism and all the backward superstition that the revolution had supposedly swept away. And in both versions, the real man disappeared beneath layers of interpretation and propaganda and selective memory. The real Grigori Yefimovich from Pokrovskoye, who could calm a hemophiliac child whether through technique or coincidence, or something genuinely inexplicable, who believed sincerely that he carried a divine mission and also believed sincerely that sin was a necessary precursor to grace, who drank and groped women and accepted bribes and sent telegrams about vegetables to his village and telegrams about faith to the Empress, who survived a near-fatal stabbing in 1914, only to be killed by men who thought they were patriots, who was buried in ground, blessed by priests, and exhumed by revolutionaries, and burned to ash because both sides needed him to be more than human, so they could use him as a symbol of whatever they opposed, and the actual details of his life and death, the things that can be documented from surveillance reports, and autopsy findings and contemporary testimony. Those details often contradict the legend, but are less compelling than the legend, because reality lacks the narrative symmetry that myth provides. The Okhrana files, now housed in Russian archives, document a final irony, that in May 1916, 7 months before his death, Rasputin received an anonymous typed letter warning him that if he did not pressure the Tsar to convene the Duma and make ministers responsible to the people, he would be killed. The letter stating, "No mercy will be shown to you. Our hand will not shrink, as did the hand of Gausiva," referring to the woman who had stabbed him in 1914, stating, "Wherever you are, death will follow you. The die has been cast. The lot has fallen on us 10 chosen men." And whether Yusupov and his co-conspirators were connected to this letter, or whether it came from a different group entirely, is unknown. But it demonstrates that by mid-1916, multiple factions had identified Rasputin as a target. Multiple plans were circulating. The idea that killing him would solve something had achieved a kind of critical mass among people who opposed the regime, or who supported the regime, but thought it needed reform, and this shared fantasy that removing one man would fix systemic problems that had been building for decades, this magical thinking about political violence, characterized not just the Rasputin assassination, but much of the period's revolutionary and counter-revolutionary thought. The idea that if only the right person could be removed, or the right person could be elevated, then history would shift, then the disaster could be averted, when in fact history was already moving in directions no individual could control. The war was destroying the economic and social fabric of Europe. The Russian army was disintegrating. The peasantry was seizing land without waiting for legal permission. The workers were organizing Soviets. The Tsar's legitimacy had eroded to the point that even conservative officers and aristocrats were discussing the need for change. And in this context, killing Rasputin was neither necessary nor sufficient, was simply one more act of violence in a period defined by violence. One more attempt to solve a political crisis with a bullet, when the crisis was too deep for bullets to reach. The interrogation records and court documents from the immediate aftermath of the murder have been partially preserved, fragments scattered across archives in Russia and abroad. And they show that the initial police investigation identified the conspirators within 24 hours, the blood in the courtyard, and the abandoned boot, and the eyewitness testimony of servants in the Okhrana surveillance reports, all pointing directly to Yusupov, but the investigation was hampered from the start by the fact that Grand Duke Dmitry was a member of the imperial family, and therefore nominally immune from prosecution, and by the fact that prominent members of the Duma, including Purishkevich, openly admitted their involvement and dared the authorities to arrest them, and by the fact that much of the aristocracy and the merchant class and even some government officials viewed the killing as a public service, as justifiable homicide, as the removal of a malignant influence, and so the investigation never proceeded to trial, never resulted in formal charges. The conspirators were instead exiled or restricted to their estates, punishments that in the context of wartime Russia, where millions were dying in trenches and civilians were starving in cities, amounted to slaps on the wrist, and the message this sent to the broader population was that the Tsar could not or would not enforce his own laws, could not protect his wife's advisor, even against killers who boasted of their crime, and this perception of impotence contributed to the rapid collapse of authority that followed in February 1917. Yusupov lived until 1967, dying in Paris at age 80. Having fled Russia in 1919, with his wife and some fraction of his family's wealth, smuggled out in jewels and paintings, and he spent the rest of his life writing memoirs and giving interviews about the killing, always maintaining the dramatic version with the poison and the multiple gunshots and Rasputin's superhuman resistance. And he sued multiple times over portrayals of the event that he felt damaged his reputation, including a lawsuit against MGM over the film Rasputin and the Empress, which depicted his wife as having been seduced by Rasputin, a claim Yusupov vehemently denied, and which resulted in a settlement in his favor and his insistence on controlling the narrative, on being portrayed as a heroic assassin rather than a simple murderer, suggests that he understood the killing as the defining event of his life, the one thing that would make him historically significant, and whether he ever doubted the rightness of what he did, whether in his 80s living in a Parisian apartment, far from the palaces and the empire that no longer existed, he ever wondered if killing Rasputin had accomplished anything useful, or had simply added one more body to a century already drowning in bodies. Those doubts, if they existed, were not recorded in his memoirs. Purishkevich died in 1920, during the Russian Civil War, having fought with the White Army against the Bolsheviks, died still believing he had tried to save Russia from revolution by killing the man he thought was leading the monarchy to ruin, died perhaps never understanding that the revolution he feared had been made inevitable, not by any one person's influence, but by structural failures and military disasters and decisions made by rulers over decades. and that removing Rasputin had not prevented revolution, but had, if anything, hastened it by demonstrating the regime's terminal weakness. Grand Duke Dmitry survived the revolution by virtue of his exile to Persia, survived the civil war by staying out of Russia, eventually settled in France, and worked for Chanel, lived until 1942, and of all the conspirators he gave the fewest interviews, said the least about the murder, maintained a silence that might have been discretion, or might have been shame, or might have been simply the recognition that there was nothing useful to say about an event that had failed in its stated purpose. Dr. Lazavert's account of the poisoning, written in 1917, claims he prepared cyanide sufficient to kill instantly and placed it in the wine and cakes, but later evidence, including his own later admissions, and the autopsy findings, suggest he may have exaggerated or fabricated this detail, and the question of whether the poison story was a planned deception, or a spontaneous embellishment, or a genuine mistake, whether Lazavert convinced himself he had poisoned the food when he had not, remains unresolved, and demonstrates how even participants in historical events can have faulty or self-serving memories, can construct narratives that serve psychological needs or social expectations, rather than strictly adhering to fact. The theories about British involvement, particularly the role of Oswald Rayner, have generated multiple books and documentaries, but have never been definitively proven or disproven. Rayner having maintained silence about his activities in Petrograd, having died in 1961 without leaving any statement about Rasputin's death, and the British intelligence files that might confirm or deny his presence at the Yusupov Palace on December 17th have either been destroyed or remain classified or never existed in the first place. And so the British connection remains in the realm of plausible speculation, supported by circumstantial evidence, including the type of gunshot wound and the geopolitical context, and Rayner's documented presence in Petrograd and friendship with Yusupov, but lacking the documentary proof that would transform speculation into established fact. And this ambiguity, this gap in the historical record, is characteristic of intelligence operations, which by design leave minimal paper trail, and it serves as a reminder that some historical events, particularly those involving covert action, may never be fully known, may retain zones of uncertainty, no matter how many archives are opened or how many witnesses are interviewed, because the people with direct knowledge chose not to document what they knew or documented it in ways that were later destroyed or classified in perpetuity. What remains verifiable, what can be stated without speculation, is that Grigori Rasputin was killed by multiple gunshot wounds on the night of December 17th, December 30th, Gregorian calendar, 1916, that his body was disposed of in the Little Nevka River, that his killers were members of the Russian aristocracy who believed they were saving the monarchy, that they were never seriously punished, that 11 weeks later the monarchy they thought they were saving collapsed in a revolution that swept away not only the Tsar but the entire social order of Imperial Russia, and that Rasputin's influence over the Tsarina, while real, was not the cause of that collapse, but rather a symptom of deeper problems, including an autocratic system that concentrated power without accountability, a disastrous war that the regime had neither the competence to win nor the courage to exit, economic policies that failed to address peasant land hunger or working-class grievances, and a political culture that responded to calls for reform with repression and exile, and finally with the murder of reformers and dissidents by secret police or by aristocratic conspirators who thought they were above the law. And in this context, Rasputin's significance is less about what he did or did not do, less about whether his healing abilities were genuine or fraudulent, less about his personal morality or immorality, and more about what he represented to different constituencies. To the Tsarina, he represented hope for her son's survival. To the conspirators, he represented corruption and foreign influence. To the revolutionaries, he represented aristocratic decadence and mystical obscurantism. To Western observers, He represented Russian backwardness and Oriental despotism, and each of these representations says more about the people constructing them than about the man himself. And this is perhaps the final irony of Rasputin's story, that he became more powerful as a symbol after his death than he ever was as a living advisor, became a figure onto whom people could project their theories about why empires fall, and what happens when superstition replaces reason in governance, and whether killing can ever be justified by political necessity. The archives opened in Russia after 1991, including the Okhrana surveillance files, and documents from the imperial family's correspondence, reveal a more complex figure than either the hero or the demon of popular imagination, reveal a peasant who genuinely believed in his religious mission, and also exploited that mission for money and sex, who helped a hemophiliac child through means that remain medically unclear, but which brought measurable relief, who opposed the First World War on grounds that were arguably more sensible than the grounds on which Nicholas chose to fight it, who lived in a state of constant performance, constantly aware that his influence depended on maintaining the Tsarina's faith in his holiness, while also maintaining his own sense of authenticity, a psychological balancing act that required him to believe his own mythology, even as he violated its precepts. And this tension between self-belief and self-aware performance, between genuine spirituality and calculated manipulation, characterizes not only Rasputin, but many figures who achieve power through claims of special knowledge or divine favor. And studying his life offers insights not just into late Imperial Russia, but into the mechanics of charismatic authority and the relationship between belief and cynicism, and the ways that individuals navigate systems of power that offer no formal channels for people of their class. The question of what would have happened if Rasputin had not been killed, if he had survived into the revolutionary period, is counterfactual and therefore unanswerable with certainty. But the available evidence suggests his survival would not have prevented the February Revolution, because the causes of that revolution, the military defeats and bread shortages, and loss of faith in the Tsar's competence, would have operated regardless of whether Rasputin was alive or dead, and it is even possible that his survival might have hastened the revolution by providing the opposition with a continuing symbol of the regime's dysfunction, whereas his death removed that symbol and briefly allowed the monarchy's defenders to hope that his removal would stabilize the situation, a hope that was proven false within weeks, but which might have delayed certain actors from joining the revolutionary movement if they thought reform was still possible. Though this is speculation, and the historical record shows that by December 1916, the situation had deteriorated to a point where no individual's presence or absence would have altered the basic trajectory towards systemic collapse. The popular culture legacy of Rasputin, including the 1978 song by Boni Mi, which depicts him as Russia's greatest love machine, including numerous films and novels, and television series that portray him as variously a villain, a tragic figure, a mystic, a charlatan, a sexual predator, a holy fool, demonstrates the enduring fascination with his story, but also demonstrates how far popular culture tends to drift from documented history, how the legend of the unkillable monk who controlled the empress through hypnosis and brought down the Romanovs through his malign influence becomes more memorable and more marketable than the more complex reality of a Siberian peasant who exploited a hemophiliac child's medical crisis to gain access to power, who genuinely believed he was acting according to divine will, while also accepting bribes and groping women, who opposed the war for reasons that were both practical and mystical, who was killed by men who sincerely believed they were saving their country and who were catastrophically wrong about that belief. And this gap between legend and reality is not unique to Rasputin, but is characteristic of how historical figures become simplified in collective memory, how they are reduced to symbols that serve contemporary ideological or entertainment needs, rather than being understood in their full contradictory humanity. The execution method. If the forensic evidence is correct, that he received a contact shot to the forehead suggests a level of cold calculation that contradicts the melodramatic story Yusupov later told, suggests that at least one of the people in that basement room was capable of pressing a gun to another human's head and pulling the trigger at point-blank range, an act that requires either military training or sociopathic detachment or absolute conviction that the person being killed is not fully human, is instead a monster whose removal justifies any method. And this dehumanization of the target is a common feature of political assassination, the need to construct the victim as so dangerous or so evil that normal moral prohibitions against killing do not apply. And the conspirators accomplished this dehumanization, both before the killing through their discussions among themselves, and with their social circle about Rasputin as a dark force destroying Russia, and after the killing through Yusupov's memoir, which portrayed Rasputin as having superhuman resistance to death, and therefore by implication being something other than ordinarily human, something that required extraordinary measures to eliminate. And this narrative strategy, while perhaps psychologically necessary for the killers to live with what they had done, had the effect of further mythologizing Rasputin, of confirming rather than dispelling the mystical aura that had surrounded him in life. The role of the Tsarina in the events leading to Rasputin's death, and in the events that followed, deserves attention, because she has often been portrayed as weak or hysterical, or as Rasputin's dupe. But the historical record suggests a different picture, suggests a mother who was dealing with a child's life-threatening illness in an era when medicine had no effective treatment for hemophilia, who found in Rasputin someone who could provide relief, whether through calming presence or hypnotic suggestion, or simple confidence, or discontinuation of harmful treatments, who then became dependent on him because the alternative was watching her son die, and who, in defending Rasputin against his critics, was defending her son's only source of relief. And viewed from this perspective, her actions, while politically disastrous, were humanly comprehensible, were the actions of a mother prioritizing her child over political considerations, over public opinion, over the advice of ministers and relatives. And the tragedy is that this maternal devotion, which in other circumstances might be praised, became in the context of autocratic politics a mechanism for destabilizing the regime, because Alexandra's determination to keep Rasputin close translated into his influence over appointments and policy decisions. And this influence was real, even if it was often overstated by contemporaries and by later historians. And removing Rasputin did not remove Alexandra's need for someone to heal Alexei, did not address the underlying medical problem, simply removed the person who had been providing relief, and left her both grief-stricken at losing someone she considered a holy man and a friend, and terrified that her son's next bleeding episode would be fatal. And this grief and terror may explain her political paralysis in the weeks after Rasputin's death, her inability to rally support for the monarchy, or to respond effectively to the crisis that was building, because she was dealing simultaneously with political catastrophe and personal loss and medical fear. And the people around her who might have helped her navigate this situation were either dead or exiled or had lost faith in the regime. And so by the time the February Revolution erupted, she was isolated and powerless, and the Tsar was at military headquarters, and the government had ceased to function. And the revolution, when it came, was almost anticlimactic, was less a violent overthrow than a sudden recognition that the emperor had no clothes, that the autocracy's claim to authority had become a collective fiction that nobody believed anymore, and therefore ceased to exist. The forensic reevaluation, conducted by Roger Bayard and published in 2024 in the journal Forensic Science Medicine and Pathology, represents the kind of cold retrospective analysis that can sometimes clarify historical events, can strip away mythology and self-serving memoirs and national propaganda to reveal what the physical evidence actually shows. And in this case, what it shows is that Rasputin died from gunshot wounds administered in a manner consistent with execution, rather than the chaotic struggle described by Yusupov, died probably within minutes or at most within an hour of being shot, was dead before entering the water, and was not poisoned. And these findings do not answer every question about the night of December 17th, but they eliminate some of the more melodramatic claims and suggest that the actual killing was more straightforward than the legend, was simply men with guns shooting an unarmed man who had been lured to a basement under false pretenses. And this simpler version of events, while less dramatic, is more credible and more consistent with what typically happens in political assassinations, which are usually not elaborate cat-and-mouse games, but rather ambushes where the victim is outnumbered and outgunned and dies quickly and unglamorously, and the elaboration comes later in the stories the killers tell to justify themselves, and in the stories that cultures tell to make sense of historical turning points. The fact that Rasputin's remains were destroyed, were burned until nothing identifiable remained, means that modern DNA analysis or more sophisticated forensic techniques cannot be applied, cannot provide additional data beyond what the original autopsy and the post-mortem photograph reveal. And this destruction was deliberate, was the revolutionaries' attempt to erase him completely, to ensure that there would be no relics, no body that could be venerated, or that could become a site of pilgrimage for people who still believed in his holiness. And in this sense, the revolutionaries succeeded. There is no grave, there is no physical place where Rasputin exists, except the museum basement in the Yusupov Palace, where tourists can stand in the room where he was killed and try to imagine the events of that night. And even that room has been renovated and restored, and is no longer exactly as it was in 1916, is itself a kind of recreation, a stage set for historical imagination. And so Rasputin exists now only in documents and photographs and stories, exists as narrative rather than as matter. And this transformation from physical presence to pure narrative is what happens to all historical figures eventually. But it happened to Rasputin more completely than most, because of the deliberate destruction of his body, and because the people who knew him, his family and followers and enemies, are all dead and have been dead for generations. And because the Russia he lived in no longer exists, was destroyed by the revolution and the civil war and the Soviet period and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the Petrograd where he walked is now St. Petersburg again, but is not the same city. The streets have different names. The buildings have different purposes. The Yusupov Palace is a museum. The Winter Palace is a museum. Tsarskoye Selo is a museum. Everywhere he went is a museum now, which is another way of saying everywhere he went is dead. The question of whether the conspirators' action was morally justified, given their sincere belief that Rasputin was destroying Russia, has been debated by historians and ethicists, and has no definitive answer, because it requires weighing the intentions of the actors against the actual consequences of their action, and against abstract principles about when, if ever, political violence is legitimate. And the answer depends on which ethical framework one applies. A consequentialist analysis, looking at outcomes, would conclude the assassination was not justified because it did not achieve its stated goal of stabilizing the monarchy and may have contributed to its destabilization. A deontological analysis, focusing on the nature of the act itself, would conclude that murder is wrong regardless of motivation. A virtue ethics analysis would ask whether the conspirators displayed courage and practical wisdom, or rather displayed recklessness and poor judgment, and each framework produces a different answer. And this multiplicity of possible moral evaluations suggests that the question as posed is incomplete, suggests that political violence exists in a domain where simple moral judgments fail, because the context is always complex. The information available to actors is always partial, the consequences are always unpredictable, and the narratives constructed afterward are always shaped by whoever won the subsequent power struggles and got to write the history. And in this case, the Bolsheviks won and wrote a history in which both Rasputin and his killers were cast as villains, both representing different aspects of the old regime that the revolution had swept away. And this official Soviet narrative dominated for 70 years until the archives began to open and historians could access primary documents and construct more nuanced accounts. The letters between Rasputin and the imperial family, preserved in archives, show a man who wrote in a peasant's unschooled Russian, who spelled erratically and punctuated idiosyncratically, who mixed religious language with practical advice and gossip, who signed his letters Grigori, without the formal patronymic, who addressed the Tsarina in terms that contemporaries found inappropriately familiar, calling her mama or little mother, who spoke of dreams and visions and prophecies, but also spoke of timber contracts and appointments to the Holy Synod. And these letters reveal a relationship that was genuinely affectionate and genuinely dependent. Alexandra, relying on Rasputin for emotional support as much as for his supposed ability to heal Alexei, turning to him when she felt isolated in the court, when she felt her German origins made her suspect among Russian nationalists, when she felt overwhelmed by the responsibilities of monarchy and by the personal burden of having transmitted hemophilia to her son, and Rasputin providing not just prayers but reassurance, telling her that God was watching over the family, that Alexei would survive, that Russia would prevail in the war. Reassurances that were psychologically valuable, even if they were empirically unfounded. And this emotional dependency made her vulnerable to his influence, and simultaneously made her fiercely protective of him, unwilling to hear criticism, quick to dismiss negative reports as lies spread by his enemies. And this dynamic was exploited by Rasputin, who understood that his access to power depended on maintaining Alexandra's faith in him, and simultaneously exploited by people around Rasputin, including the merchant Simonovich, who acted as his secretary, and who arranged bribes from businessmen seeking favors, who managed the flow of petitioners to Rasputin's apartment, who helped monetize the holy man's influence. And this network of exploitation and dependence surrounding Rasputin illustrates how informal power operates in autocratic systems, how influence flows through personal relationships rather than through institutional channels, how the lack of transparent procedures for making decisions creates opportunities for corruption and creates uncertainty about who actually holds power. The surveillance reports show that Rasputin was aware of being watched, that he sometimes taunted the Okhrana agents following him, that he once told an agent, "I saw a detective hiding from me behind a lift. I felt quite sorry for him. If I had succeeded in discovering his name, it would have gone badly with him," which suggests both that he knew he was being monitored and that he believed he had enough power to punish individual agents. And this belief was probably correct. The Tsarina, having intervened multiple times to have agents removed or reassigned when they filed reports, she considered disrespectful to Rasputin. And this ability to manipulate even the secret police demonstrates how far his influence extended by 1916, but also demonstrates the limits of that influence, because the Okhrana continued to surveil him, continued to compile detailed reports on his activities, and those reports were read by people in the government who were building their own case against him, who were collecting evidence, not for criminal prosecution, which would have required the Tsarina's approval, which would never be granted, but rather for character assassination, for leaking to newspapers, for sharing with foreign ambassadors, for using in propaganda designed to undermine public confidence in the monarchy. And in this sense, the surveillance of Rasputin was less about controlling him and more about documenting his behavior for future use against the regime. And the conspirators who killed him almost certainly had access to these reports, almost certainly used them to justify their action to themselves and to potential supporters, and almost certainly were influenced by them in their decision that Rasputin represented such a danger that assassination was the only solution. The night of December 17th, as reconstructed from all available sources, begins with Yusupov, arriving at Rasputin's apartment near midnight, driving his own automobile, which was unusual for someone of his social standing, who normally would have used a chauffeur, but which makes sense if the goal was to minimize witnesses, and Rasputin getting into the car and being driven through streets that were dark and cold and empty, because Petrograd, in December at midnight, in wartime, is not a place where people walk casually, and they arrive at the palace, which is dark except for the lights that Yusupov has arranged to be visible from the basement, to make it seem that there is a party happening there, and Rasputin is led down the stairs into the room that has been prepared with furniture and a gramophone and food and wine, and Yusupov stays with him talking, playing for time, waiting for Irina, who will never come because she is not in the city, and upstairs the other conspirators wait with increasing nervousness, because the plan was that Rasputin would eat the poisoned food and die quickly and quietly, and instead he is eating and drinking and showing no symptoms, and after an hour or more, Yusupov goes upstairs to consult with the others, and they realize the poison has failed, and they need to improvise, and someone, probably Yusupov, though possibly Purishkevich, or possibly, if British involvement is real, possibly Rayner, takes a gun and goes back to the basement, and at some point in the next few minutes Rasputin is shot. The sequence and the exact circumstances being disputed, and whether he was shot while sitting at the table, or whether there was a struggle, or whether he tried to run, or whether he was simply executed where he sat, cannot be determined with certainty, but the forensic evidence shows contact wound to the forehead and 2 additional wounds to the torso, and the conspirators' behavior after the shooting, the panic, the contradictory stories, the decision to dispose of the body in the river rather than leaving it where it fell or reporting it to authorities, all suggest that the actual event did not go according to plan, that something happened in that basement that was messier and more traumatic than they had anticipated, and that the story they told afterward was partially an attempt to impose narrative order on an experience that had been chaotic and frightening and morally compromising. The disposal of the body, the drive through pre-dawn Petrograd with a corpse wrapped in cloth in the back of the automobile, the arrival at Petrovsky Bridge, the effort required to lift a dead body and maneuver it to the railing and push it through an ice hole into the freezing water. These physical details that Yusupov glossed over in his memoir would have required considerable effort and would have created additional opportunities for witnesses, for evidence to be left behind, for the conspirators to be seen and identified, and the fact that they nevertheless proceeded with this disposal method, rather than, for example, burying the body on Yusupov's estate, where it might never have been found, suggests either poor planning or panic, or a commitment to the narrative that Rasputin had drowned in an accident while drunk, a narrative that would only be plausible if his body was found in the river, and this commitment to the cover story, even after the poison had failed and the whole plan had gone wrong, suggests that the conspirators maintained some faith in their ability to control the narrative, some belief that their social status would protect them from serious consequences. And this belief proved largely correct. They were identified immediately. The police investigation led directly to them within 24 hours, but none of them were ever seriously punished. The protection afforded by their aristocratic status and by the political support they received from other nobles and from Duma members being sufficient to shield them from legal accountability. And this impunity was itself a symptom of the regime's weakness, its inability to enforce its own laws against the aristocracy, its effective acknowledgement that there were 2 legal systems, one for peasants and workers and ordinary people, and another for the nobility who could commit murder and face only exile to their country estates. The Tsarina's reaction to Rasputin's death, as recorded in letters and diary entries, shows genuine grief. She wrote to Nicholas that our friend has left us, and that she felt his presence would guide them from beyond death. She attended his funeral, despite it being held in secret. She placed an icon in his coffin, signed by herself and her children. And in the weeks after his death, her letters show increasing desperation, increasing sense of isolation, increasing awareness that the situation was collapsing, but decreasing ability to articulate any plan for addressing it. And by the time the February Revolution began, she was writing to Nicholas, begging him to be firm, to crush the rebellion, to hang the leaders. Advice that Nicholas could not have followed even if he had wanted to, because the army refused to obey orders to fire on civilians. The troops in Petrograd garrison having mutinied, the generals at the front having told Nicholas they would not support him if he tried to resist the provisional government's demands that he abdicate. And so, within days, the 300-year Romanov dynasty ended not with dramatic resistance, but with Nicholas signing an abdication document in a railway car, while Alexandra and the children remained under house arrest at Tsarskoye Selo. And when the revolutionary troops came to search the palace and to confiscate weapons and documents, they found Rasputin's grave and demanded it be exhumed. And Alexandra begged them not to disturb it, but her begging carried no weight, because she was no longer empress, but merely a prisoner, and the corpse was dug up and burned, and the smoke from that fire carried away whatever remained of the man who had been Grigori Yefimovich from Pokrovskoye. The 16 months between Rasputin's murder and the execution of the imperial family in Yekaterinburg in July 1918 can be seen as a long descent. The provisional government, unable to end the war, or address land reform, or control the Soviets that were springing up in every city and garrison. The Bolsheviks seizing power in October 1917 and immediately beginning to consolidate a new form of dictatorship. The civil war erupting between Reds and Whites. The imperial family moved from Tsarskoye Selo to Tobolsk and then to Yekaterinburg, their living conditions deteriorating, their guards becoming more hostile, and finally on the night of July 17, 1918, they were awakened and told they were being moved for their safety, and were led to the basement of the Ipatiev house, and were shot, all 7 of them, Nicholas and Alexandra and their 5 children, along with 4 servants who had chosen to stay with them, killed by a Bolshevik execution squad, and their bodies initially thrown down a mine shaft, and then moved and buried in a forest, where they remained hidden for 70 years, and when they were finally discovered in 1991 and identified through DNA analysis and reburied with Orthodox ceremony in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg. The reburial was attended by descendants of the Romanovs, who had survived by living in exile, and also by Russian officials, and by Orthodox clergy, and by crowds of people mourning a lost world, mourning not necessarily the autocracy itself, but the certainty it had represented, the sense of order and continuity, however illusory that sense had been. And in this context, Rasputin's murder appears not as the cause of the dynasty's fall, but as an early symptom, as a moment when it became clear that the autocracy no longer commanded the obedience, or even the respect of its own nobility, that violence had become the preferred method for resolving political disputes, that the institutions that should have channeled conflict into legal or political processes had ceased to function, and that the country was sliding toward a catastrophe that no individual murder could prevent or precipitate, but which was emerging from deeper structural failures that had been building for decades. The lesson of Rasputin's assassination, if there is a lesson, is that magical thinking about political violence. The belief that removing one person will solve systemic problems is almost always wrong, is almost always a failure to understand that individuals operate within structures, and that removing an individual leaves the structure intact, and the structure will simply produce another individual to fill the role, or will continue to malfunction, even with that role unfilled. And the conspirators who killed Rasputin believed sincerely that they were saving Russia, believed that his influence over the Tsarina was the key problem undermining the war effort and destabilizing the government. And they were wrong, not because Rasputin had no influence. He clearly did, but because his influence was a symptom of deeper problems. including the autocratic system that allowed personal relationships to override institutional procedures, including the Tsarina's desperation regarding her son's health, including the Tsar's refusal to accept constitutional constraints on his power, including the military failures that were eroding confidence in the regime's competence, including the economic pressures created by wartime mobilization, and removing Rasputin addressed none of these underlying causes, and in fact, by demonstrating that even the Empress's closest advisor could be murdered with impunity, it probably accelerated the loss of confidence in the regime's ability to maintain order. The forensic evidence that Rasputin died from gunshot wounds rather than from poison and drowning, that he was killed quickly rather than after a prolonged struggle, strips away the mythology and reveals a more brutal truth, that political assassination is not a heroic act, but a failure of politics, a decision to use violence when persuasion and institutional mechanisms fail or are not attempted. And the fact that the conspirators felt the need to mythologize their action, to portray Rasputin as unkillable and therefore inhuman, suggests they understood at some level that what they had done was morally compromising, was murder regardless of their justifications, and the elaborate story served to distance them psychologically from the reality of having killed an unarmed man who had trusted Yusupov enough to get into his automobile at midnight. The archive in St. Petersburg, where Rasputin's surveillance files and the documents from the murder investigation and the autopsy report are housed, also contains files on thousands of other people who were monitored by the Okhrana, files on revolutionaries and liberals and anarchists and ordinary people who said something critical about the government in a letter that was intercepted. And visiting that archive now more than a century after the events described in its documents, sitting in the reading room with white gloves handling pages that were typed on manual typewriters or written in faded ink, pages that document surveillance and interrogations and deportations to Siberia and eventually executions, creates a strange temporal vertigo, a sense of touching a world that is utterly gone, and yet whose consequences still echo. The surveillance state that the Okhrana pioneered, being refined and expanded by the Soviet secret police, and continuing in different forms today, the suspicion between state and citizen that characterized late Imperial Russia, reappearing in different guises, the use of conspiracy theories and character assassination as political weapons, being a tactic that Rasputin's enemies employed and that politicians employ now. And in this sense, studying Rasputin's assassination is not merely an exercise in historical curiosity, but an examination of recurring patterns in how political systems fail, in how violence is justified, in how myths are constructed to explain traumatic events, in how individuals become symbols, and symbols become more powerful than the individuals they represent. The room in the Yusupov Palace basement, where Rasputin died, has been visited by millions of tourists since the palace became a museum. People from around the world coming to stand in the space where a historical event occurred, photographing the furniture and the walls and each other, trying to imagine what happened here on December 17, 1916, trying to connect with history through physical proximity. And the palace guides tell the story of the murder, with varying degrees of accuracy and embellishment, depending on their knowledge and their audience. And the experience of visiting is simultaneously moving and strange because the room is simultaneously a real place where a real person died violently and a tourist attraction, a site of historical interest packaged for consumption. And this dual nature of historical sites, their authenticity and their commercialization, mirrors the dual nature of historical figures like Rasputin, who exist simultaneously as real people who lived and died, and as symbols that continue to be used for various purposes. The final thing that can be said with certainty, drawn from public records and forensic evidence and contemporary accounts, is that Grigori Rasputin, born in obscurity in Siberia, rose through a combination of genuine charisma and calculated manipulation and historical accident to a position of influence over the imperial family, that this influence, while real, was also exaggerated by his enemies. for political purposes, that he was killed by aristocratic conspirators who believed incorrectly that his death would stabilize the regime, that his death instead marked one more step toward the regime's collapse, which followed 11 weeks later, and that his story has been told and retold in countless versions, each reflecting the concerns and prejudices of the teller, and that the truth about his life and death lies somewhere between the demon of legend and the saint of hagiography, lies in the archival documents and the forensic evidence, and the testimony of people who knew him, lies in recognizing him as a human being who lived in a specific historical moment and whose actions were shaped by and helped to shape the catastrophic events that destroyed the world he knew. Where he came from no longer exists. The village of Pokrovskoye has changed beyond recognition. The Tsarist Empire is gone. The Soviet Union that replaced it is gone. And what remains is story and document, and the room in the basement where something terrible happened one winter night, and the lesson that violence rarely solves what its perpetrators hope it will solve, and the question of what we learn from studying assassination and revolution and the fall of empires, which is perhaps that empires fall not because of any one person's influence, but because they become unable to adapt to changing circumstances, unable to distribute power and resources equitably, unable to maintain legitimacy in the eyes of those they govern, and that when collapse comes, it comes quickly and sweeps away not only the rulers, but the whole social order, and that those who thought they were saving that order through violence often discover too late that they accelerated its destruction.